There's been a last-minute rule change for this weekend's Japanese Grand Prix that even F1 2026's biggest critic Max Verstappen thinks could help solve a big qualifying problem. But, Jon Noble, before we get into that, we need to talk about something else Max gave us today, which was the most extraordinary moment on Thursday when he banished a journalist from his media session.
Yeah, there's been some bizarre press conferences this year. I'll go back to the Bahrain test where we had Max launched a full-scale attack on the regulations. We had calls for safety changes to be made to the regulations. And today, another chapter. I've spoken to some people in the paddock who can't quite recollect the time a driver's ever picked out a journalist and asked them to leave. But you were there. I was actually there. I was busy scurrying around. Tell us what happened.
Yeah, so this all goes back to Abu Dhabi last year, amazingly, because obviously it's months since then, when in the post-race press conference, journalist Giles Richards from the Guardian asked Max about his crash with George Russell back in the Spanish Grand Prix in May, the lost points there as a result of the penalty he got, and whether he regretted it because of the narrow margin by which he lost the 2025 World Championship. Max took massive umbrage at that question, didn't like it. I think he felt that the tone and the nature of the question was antagonistic and disrespectful. I don't think it was. I think it was a legitimate question to ask. Whether you think it was asked as well as it could have been is entirely down to your opinion. He didn't like it at the time. He gave an answer that made it very, very clear what he thought of it. I'm guessing this is the first time they've seen each other since then, because basically before, or just as the media session was starting, the first person started to ask his question. That person happened, I think, to be sat right next to the Guardian's representative, and Max just said, basically, no, wait a second, I'm not talking until he leaves. There's a little bit of back and forth over why. It became very clear it was about Abu Dhabi, and then the journalist left. And there's been, unsurprisingly, massive social media discourse over this about, Max being savage, how unfair it was, depending on which camp you're in there, whether journalists should have boycotted it as a result. It's bizarre as much. We're there to do a job. We can't just walk out just because there's been something that you don't know the full story of has broken out. But you're right, it's very bizarre, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that there's been occasions where there's been confrontations in press conferences. I think of the days with Michael Schumacher and some of the British tabloid press at the times when they were trying to say, do you feel as though you're a cheat after certain things had happened? I've seen bust-ups in the media centre between journalists when they've fallen out over stories or relationships. But quite rare for something so specific to happen. Normally, if there's any antagonism, it's dealt with by the PRs and dealt with privately. So I think it's just a very interesting mindset of Max Verstappen, who's so unflustered by everything. He races happily wheel to wheel at 200 miles an hour with, other amazing racing drivers. Unflustered, but he's made a point of this. Yeah,
it shows that he's still, there's a grudge that he's got to bear there, and it also speaks a little bit to this idea that Max, generally speaking, is totally calm and collected, but when he gets emotional, he can react very, very strongly in those situations. It also doesn't disabuse us of the notion that he's on a hair trigger at the moment in an F1 context with displeasure about the rules. But speaking about the rules and Max's displeasure, he was at least a bit more optimistic that a rule change, as mentioned at the top of this video, for this weekend might help in qualifying. So first and foremost, Jon, explain the rule change.
Yeah, what's come clear from meetings with team representatives and the FIA after the Chinese Grand Prix is that the racing, it's dividing opinion, but generally it's fine. It needs some minor tweaking. It doesn't need ripping up and starting again. The problem's qualifying. The problem is the drivers don't like energy management. The teams don't think it's a great spectacle. We've got weird quirks, like we reported and revealed this week about the Charles Leclerc sprint qualifying lap in China. It was derailed by a lift-off that took him out of a throttle map position and wrecked the lap. All these quirks they don't like. So qualifying needs to be addressed. There's plans going longer term to sort it. But for this weekend, Japan is one of the more energy-starved tracks. Not as bad as Melbourne, but it's on that edge. And to cure it, they're actually going to pull back on the amount of energy you can recharge. It's dropped from 9 megajoules, which is the limit, down to 8. So it should minimise the need for too much lift and coasting, too much super clipping, reduces super clipping by around 4 seconds. I like the estimate, but it's been unanimous support from manufacturers, and we'll see what impact it makes.
Yeah, basically it will mean that the lap overall is slightly slower, because if you're recharging less energy over the lap, it means you've got less electrical power to play with in total, but it's meant to be a more authentic, or not authentic, that's the wrong word, because that's a more racing situation with these rules, but a more flat out, more conventional qualifying spectacle, shall we say. And it's a big talking point here because we have a mega circuit to save. We saw what happened in Melbourne. Turns 9 and 10 was the great example of how bad these cars can be in qualifying. We even saw it in China, where certain corners the cars looked like they were broken, and it was quite painful. Here, there's so many places that can happen, like fears about lifting and coasting or super clipping or whatever. The long straight that run to turns 1 and 2, all the S's through the first sector. The fear there that they're not going to be using the MGUK at all during those sweeps, so you'll be more power limited. You won't be grip limited there. Spoon curve because it's a long straight before then. 130R, not really a corner for a long time anyway, but the principle of going in then unnecessarily slowly. But my two biggest concerns of what I've been talking to you about yesterday, are the Degner curves, which I think are two of the best corners on the circuit. That's the double right-hander turn, 8 and 9. They're Degner, they're not a number. This is a track with proper names for the corners. And that Degner 1 is just like the ultimate. I think it's the best corner on the circuit. There's no room for error. You get a massive reward if you nail it, and you'll lose 2 or 3 attempts if you're too conservative through there. But one driver told me that based on the old qualifying limit, where you could recharge to the maximum, you were super clipping into there, or they were on the sim, which then meant they were flat out through Degner 1, because flat out meant a much lower speed than normal. So you're talking, 20, 30, 40 kilometres an hour slower. Challenge completely gone. So the idea is this should help avoid that, but I think that will come down to where teams decide they don't have to save energy, because they're still going to be harvesting 8 megajoules over the lap.
Yeah, the benefit of having more deployment down a straight is still massive. You can't regain that time any better way than harvesting energy. And unfortunately, there's one of the unintended consequences of the rules is that the place you need to harvest energy the best is actually into fast corners, because you're not braking, so you need to be lifting and coasting or super clipping, which then takes away the challenge of actually these fast corners. So you've got this inverse proportion of the faster and more spectacular a corner is, the worse it is if you're trying to manage your energy. But we may have a flip side here, and I think this was something that came up in Melbourne, we've not got the full answer for, is do energy starved tracks actually deliver more entertainment in the race? Because the cars are struggling for energy, you get more overtaking, and you get more of this strategic toing and froing. So are we going to be able to counter these two things and deliver a good qualifying and a good race?
Well, I think people who are more sympathetic for that style of racing will say, Japan was rubbish last year. It was a very, very stagnant race. I didn't think it was rubbish because you had lead cars within very close proximity and there was a tension to it. But it comes down to ultimately whether you define the quality of a race by how much movement there is. So it could be, if this doesn't help a massive amount in qualifying, it might be that still means that we're in for a varied race. Who knows? I'm very curious to see what happens with the track action. Drivers very much sort of hedging their bets slightly. They're almost universal that when they tried this in the sim, it was a problem. So they are, I think, very hopeful. Like they'll be hoping more than expecting that it will help for qualifying itself. The other thing within this is that even though there does seem to be broad agreement that this is a step in the right direction, from what I've heard, at least a couple of teams are quite annoyed by it still, because they don't mind the rule change, but they're annoyed because they only got told about it yesterday.
Yeah, all the teams and drivers have done all their preparation based on 9 megajoules. So everything resets with 8. It changes everything. It changes where you approach corners, how you harvest. Are you super clipping? Are you lifting and coasting? Where do you put your deployment? So it's basically rip it up, start again. So a lot of work to do tomorrow morning. And I think this reduction to 8 megajoules is a tiny sticking plaster on the wider problem. We know there's a meeting taking place in the gap between here and Miami to try to come up with a better rule set for qualifying, make some big changes. This could be more significant than just adjusting harvesting and deployment. So I think we need to see what changes are made and can they actually come up with something that works better for qualifying.
And very quickly, John, on a completely different topic, because this was just a really interesting and fun thing for me today that you got to the bottom of. The Mercedes trick wing, the front wing that we saw in China, was subject to all this speculation, definitive claims about what they were trying to do with how much the front wing was backing off in stages. It's not quite that interesting, but interesting in its own right, the actual explanation.
Yeah, it was fascinating. It was a week of speculation about what was this Mercedes wing doing in multi-transition stages, how they managed to get around the 400 milliseconds allowance you're allowed between straight line mode and corner mode. Was it helping with brake balance? Was it helping out with downforce? The reality was Mercedes got a miscalculation of their hydraulic power. There wasn't enough force pushing the wing back up for when the car was travelling over a certain speed. So it caught them out in qualifying. They changed George Russell's wing in qualifying. They thought they'd cured it for the race and hadn't cured it. So it's been sorted. They've made improvements. It should be in hand for this weekend. But also reminds me, I had a joke with Ferrari today. It reminds me of that time of testing where Ferrari appeared in a test and appeared as dimple on the nose, and there's all speculation about this clever aero trick they've done and brilliant design, and it turned out a support had broken and it was just a failure.